Well, hello there,
Hello.
internet people.
How's it
is, what is today? Science, it's Science Bro. We're doing Science Bro IPM part 2.
go?
Deux.
Part deux.
We propose the concept that the ratio of organisms in the soil has an effect on nitrogen, which then has an effect on pests. And
Yes.
so today we wanted to dive into that a little bit deeper. It's an extremely complex concept, and it's far more than we can touch on today, but we wanted to take a couple slides from our Crescent Method basic training course where we go into this for an entire session. And so we're going to start with talking about the nitrogen cycle today and how that affects downstream effects of plant growth and ultimately pest pressure or overall yield. And I forgot the music again. Sorry about that. I'll get this shit figured out at some point. YouTube doesn't even pay attention till you get 35 videos, so I got a couple more to figure this out before I really become a content creator. So here we go, Famablam. You want to talk about the nitrogen cycle?
I mean, that's what we're here for, I guess.
That is what we're here for. So let's talk about the nitrogen cycle, Sarah Scamness.
All right.
So what is the nitrogen cycle?
Well, so it's just a very important concept to understand when you're trying to, utilize these microbes in order to grow a plant that's healthy. And so there's just some particular concepts that you need to understand when it comes to these particular microbes and this nitrogen cycle, as this particular molecule will affect the way that the plant is able to be healthy. As you know, or at least I think you've talked about before, when it comes to minerals, the plant doesn't really have a natural gate when it comes to how much the nitrogen absorbs. So if you're cramming a bunch of nitrogen into the plant, and also so too much and in the wrong form, will bring about pests and disease. So we're just going to jump into what the natural nitrogen cycle would be for those of us who are wanting to align ourselves with this process. So there's some key concepts to it. So mineralization, nitrification, denitrification, those are all modes of the forms of nitrogen as it moves through this cycle. And you'll find, as we talk about it, that this F to B ratio, or this fungi to bacteria ratio, is very important in the form of nitrogen in the system through this natural cycle. So in a nutshell, this is what the nitrogen cycle looks like. So a bunch of arrows, right? So we've got nitrogen coming in as a gas. Nitrogen is very abundant in our atmosphere. It's like, 75% of our atmosphere. And so nitrogen will infuse into the soil and meet up with some nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So these bacteria will create a colony, whether it's rhizobium that create a colony within the root, or it's a free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria. It doesn't really matter which type of nitrogen-fixing bacteria we're talking about. The main process is the same. So these nitrogen-fixing bacteria will form a big colony. That colony will start to get to a certain mass where the conditions inside of the colony change. Actually, the inside of the colony goes a little anaerobic, and that triggers the bacteria to start to make a certain type of enzyme. So in nature, enzymes are what mainly do most of the work when it comes to breaking bonds. So nitrogen, when it enters into the soil, it enters in as N2. The bond between both of those nitrogen molecules is a triple bond. So it's very expensive to break. It takes a lot of energy to break that. So these nitrogen-fixing bacteria that have made this association with the roots start to be able to produce this enzyme when they get to a certain mass, because they've made this relationship with the roots. They're getting fed by the roots. They're able to grow to a certain colony size. Now they can start reproducing this particular enzyme because they've met the conditions to do so. So they make this enzyme, they break that nitrogen bond, and they start consuming that nitrogen. And then once they meet their maximum of the nitrogen that they need for their colony, then they start giving it back to the plant in the form of like amino acids. So that nitrogen then starts being taken up by the plant. Remember, it costs the plant a lot. It pretty much has to bank on this association in order to get this nitrogen into it. So it's not going to give it up so easily at all, really. If it ever comes out in the plant in root exudate form, it's going to be very, very, very minimal. So the plant will retain pretty much all of the nitrogen in its body until it dies, basically. So this plant here will have taken up all the nitrogen that come from this nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And then once it dies, it will then get decomposed by the fungi and bacteria. Those are your decomposing organisms in the soil. So when those decomposer organisms start tearing down that plant and absorbing all that nitrogen into their system, it's now held within their bodies and will basically stay there until they get predated upon by the next level of predators. So the big fish eating the small fish. So you have to have these predators in the system at a certain level to be able to eat these bacteria and fungi, these base level organisms, to release that nitrogen into the soil. Now, when they eat this nitrogen, or when they consume these bacteria and fungi and they absorb this nitrogen into the bodies of the predators, they don't need that much. They need about like a fifth of that amount of nitrogen. So they will excrete out, this is why they call it the poop loop, they will excrete out the excess nitrogen, right? And that will be in the form of NH4. And this first step process is called mineralization. So we take nitrogen and it comes into the plant through this lovely bacteria association, again, an organism doing that. And so that becomes an organic form of nitrogen. And then through this decomposition and then this predation, it then turns into a mineralized form of nitrogen called NH4, ammonium. So this is the Bloom formula. And this NH4 will remain as such if the pH of the system is conducive to do so, which means it has to be below 7. So let's just move into mineralization. So when the plant takes up that nitrogen, the plant then dies. It gets decomposed by the bacteria and the fungi, the decomposers in the system. The bacteria and fungi get predated upon. That excess nitrogen that they then take up by eating those bacteria and fungi then have to be excreted out into the soil. And it will be excreted in the form of ammonium, NH4. And it will remain in the form of NH4 so long as that pH is below 7. So now what makes the pH of the soil, when it comes to organisms, what makes the pH of the soil below 7, right? So when we think about what these base level organisms produce, bacteria will produce alkaline glues. The fungi will produce organic acids, humic acids, fulvic acids, ulmic acids,
Fractionated acids.
For a whole bunch of fractionated acids. All those acids is what gets produced. And so if we have a certain threshold of fungi in the system as far as biomass goes to make that pH below that threshold of 7, then your form of nitrogen will stay NH4. And that form of nitrogen then gets cycled back to the plant. The plant can absorb it, and then it can start this cycle again, or it can go right up into the bacteria and the fungi. Those guys can absorb it and then get predated upon. And this cycle can just continue and continue and continue in the form of ammonium, so long as we are selecting for ammonium by making sure we have enough of these organic acids in the system, by having enough fungi in the system, enough beneficial fungi in terms of biomass. Now, if we don't have enough fungi in the system in order to keep that pH below that 7 threshold, then then we switch to nitrification. So what happens is that this NH4 that gets released from this decomposer predator to prey interaction here then starts to wake up some of these nitrifying bacteria that start to do their job when the threshold of pH goes above 7. So these bacteria then, remember, they make alkaline glues. So if they're in mass numbers out of balance and producing more alkaline glues than we are in producing, these lovely organic acids from the fungi, then these bacteria will start producing the enzymes to convert ammonium to nitrite first and then to nitrate. So eventually you end up with a whole bunch of nitrate in the system. Whether you want that or not, that's what will happen if that balance is not paid attention to. So hopefully you know that this nitrate is the veg formula. And if you're getting a whole bunch of this veg formula in the wrong part of the harvest, then you can inundate the plant with nitrate unknowingly and then wonder why you're getting a whole bunch of pests and powdery mildew, pest and disease, but definitely pests as well. But in this system, we may not have actually gone anaerobic just yet. We're just out of balance as far as bacteria with making the alkaline glues versus the fungi making the organic acids. But this nitrate will then also be taken up by the plant, or it can be taken up by the decomposers, and it can go around and around in this process as well. So if you think about this when it comes to natural systems, right? So in the spring, right, we get an influx of moisture, rain, snow melting, all these things that we wake up all of these organisms in the soil. The first ones to really start
doing the work
are the bacteria. I mean, everybody's getting to work, but they're the fastest to reproduce in the system. And so you get a huge bloom of bacteria in the system because we have a whole bunch of water and a whole bunch of, hopefully you have a whole bunch of organic matter in your soil and on top. So you'll get a big flush of nitrate in the system, and that's when you need it. So they will bloom first and become much bigger in numbers than your fungi will be, especially if we're in an agricultural system where we're tilling soil and things like that. So it will take a much longer time for the fungi to establish in numbers and come up in numbers, especially with that balance going on. So it'll take an evening out of the watering, the rainfall will start to trickle off and you won't have such an influx of water happening in the system. And then the fungi will have the time, hopefully in the spring, to be able to establish and start swinging the pH of the soil below 7 and selecting for this ammonium in the system and at the right time for the plant to start going into bloom and fruit or flower production.
So the NH4 is the reproductive, flowering, fruiting form of nitrogen. And when you have this NO3, you are forcing the wrong type of nitrogen during the reproductive stage, which is the mathematical formula for powdery mildew or sucking pests, things like spider mites, thrips, russet mites, broad mites, etc.
Yeah. So hopefully that gives you an idea of mineralization of NH, just the nitrogen moving through the system from organic form to mineralized form, and then how it stays in that mineralized form of NH4 versus when it switches to NO3, and managing that is is important. And so managing your fungal component and feeding that fungal component is also very important. So that will look very different based on whether you're an indoor grower or a greenhouse grower, or if you're out in big fields. You know, we need to make sure that we're getting enough carbon, enough lignous material, enough fungal foods in the system. So that's kelp is a really great fungal food. I would not advise fish hydrolysate. They just stimulate the wrong guys. So anyway, making sure that we get this this balance correct will inform you and your plant with the right nitrogen at the time that you want it. So it's very important that you start getting an idea of what is the balance? What am I even starting with, and what do I need to work towards? Almost always you're starting with high bacteria and low fungi in the system. That's just the way it goes with these harvests back to back. So you just have to really make sure that you're feeding that fungi in the system, really getting a good mulch layer. I mean, we like both green and brown mulch in the system. So, but moving on to the final phase of this nitrogen in the system, which is the denitrification. So those first two phases of mineralization and nitrification all happened in an aerobic condition. It was just changing the form of nitrogen from ammonium, NH4, to nitrate. And it will, you know, those whether there's fungi in the system, enough fungi in the system or enough bacteria in the system, that will select for those. Now, if you go anaerobic, let's say you bloom out too much bacteria and you consume, with all that reproduction, you consume all the oxygen in the soil, you will start to lose some of that nitrogen as a gas. So NO2 and NO3 will start becoming basically nitrous oxide, N2O, or if you go straight from ammonium to anaerobic conditions, and it'll go right to ammonia. So you'll lose all that nitrogen in the soil as gases, and then it will just start the cycle back over again. So those are the three main components of the nitrogen cycle. So it's just really important to understand how that nitrogen moves through the system, you know, when we are trying to utilize true soil food web techniques and understandings to select for the type of nitrogen we want in the system.
So I think let's try to distill this down into like a practical application of this complicated thing. So let's start here. So this N2 is a gas. This is a triple bond, which from what I remember from Dr. Lane's classes, there's only like three things that breaks this apart. Lightning, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and the chemical nutrient formulation process. Yeah. There might be something else I'm unaware of, but nonetheless, very few things in nature break this apart. I think this is one of the first important components because this nitrogen bond is so difficult to break, the plants don't necessarily seem to have a strategy for stopping excess nitrogen because it's not something that is typically found in...
Yeah, they've never had to deal with that.
Never had to really deal with that. So, you know, after
force feeding of nitrogen.
After a lightning storm, you might get a big flush, everything turns green. Whoops, moving my bubble around. Sorry about that. So we have this nitrogen in the air being broken down and becoming available. Those nitrogen-fixing bacteria that we put, the azose, you know, the different bacterial products that we put in there, those are nitrogen-fixing bacteria that perform this process.
Yes.
So it's the start of spring. We plant our plants, whether indoor, outdoor, and on the moon. We're starting our harvest cycle. We've got nitrogen-fixing bacteria that we just put onto the root zone that's being fed to the plant. Ideally, we have some sort of soil food web organisms in there now taking that forward, right?
Yeah, more than just bacteria, ideally.
Ideally. I think most farms, statistically and mathematically, are kind of stuck here at this nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So I wonder what happens if it never gets past this. We use the entire soil food web, so I wonder what's actually happening when you just stick there at when you stop at this first step of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. But nonetheless, this nitrogen's moving through the system. Something eats something smaller than it. You have a nematode eating a bacteria, protozoa, amoeba, flagellate eating a bacteria that's now producing excess nutrients to the plant. So now our plant is growing. What happens then if we start moving into the flowering stage? So we're successfully moving through here and producing NH4, and now going into the flowering or reproductive stage, we make a heavy application of a simple sugar like molasses. What then happens in this process?
Well, so let's just, for instance, if you put in a whole bunch of molasses, so a whole bunch of sugar into the system, that's a whole lot of energy. It will get utilized by the bacteria in the system. It just will. It's a simple sugar. That's what they like. That's their food resources. They will start reproducing in mass numbers according to the volume of whatever the volume was of the sugar that you added. They will reproduce and they'll use it all up. And if you add in enough sugar to go anaerobic, you'll lose any nitrogen that is in the system to the denitrification process, because that's just how that process works. Now, if all you have is bacteria in the system and you don't have the predators in the system, you'll be tying up way more than just nitrogen in the system. I mean, that nitrogen will go into the plant if you've got a nitrogen-fixing bacteria making an association with the plant. Then that nitrogen will make it into the plant in that regard, but it won't make it into the soil system, especially if you're harvesting it and removing it and never putting it into the actual soil itself. So the plant doesn't decompose in the soil, which happens a lot in a lot of these systems where you're really not getting that nitrogen into the soil. You're getting it into the plant, but it's not going into the soil per se, because that plant doesn't get a chance to die into the soil and be decomposed. So
if we're intending to have this process and we're heading into the flowering reproductive stage, and for some reason, whether an overwatering event or an overstimulation event, which I think most people really aren't hip to, not realizing that you're dislodging this process completely and jumping into denitrification by overwatering or by overstimulating that with a simple sugar, or, things are popular now with purposely harvesting anaerobic organisms and making this process force feed, which is kind of a crazy turn of events for living soil. But nonetheless, the downstream effects of short-circuiting this natural system instead of taking it around and keeping this poop loop, as they call it, so keeping this NH4 in the system, recirculating around. And if you short circuit going in anaerobic, now the nitrogen is being lost as a gas. Yeah. Calcium is precipitating and falling out of solution and going down, from what I understand, out of the root zone. It becomes more water soluble and inaccessible by your plant.
Yeah. Yeah, not to mention all the... So we just followed one element through the system. That was just the nitrogen cycle. So when you get to the anaerobic conditions, it's not just nitrogen that leaves as a gas. There are lots of other elements that also can leave as a gas as well. So it's just very... And, the enzymes that or the metabolites that are produced by anaerobic organisms also are not conducive to higher level health in plants as well. So despite
what's popular.
Despite what's popular, that's just scientifically, that's the way that it moves through the system, and that's what happens to the elements when they're exposed to these non-oxygen environments. It's just chemistry that happens. So, So
ideally, in a biological system, we'd have this mineralization process. So mineralization is the term used of taking minerals from the soil or from this nitrogen process and being broken down into soluble forms by the organisms. They call this mineralization. Yeah. And then next comes immobilization, which immobilization is then holding those nutrients in the bodies of the organisms. And then the third step is
fungi and bacteria decomposing, holding it into their bodies.
And then the third step's what? Remineralization?
Yeah, through the predation.
Yeah. So then the third step would be remineralization, which is this loop, this loop. So remineralization would be taking those same minerals that came from rocks, essentially, went into organism bodies, they got eaten by another organism, got released as an organic form, and then they get taken up again by other organisms and then go back through this process. That's remineralization.
Going back and back and back is
Right,
remineralization.
right.
Yeah. So hopefully that gives you an idea of just when you're working with the soil food web, how important it is to get it measured,
Right.
how important it is to know through these measurements what it is that you're doing above ground to affect this particular process, because nitrogen, excessive nitrogen in a plant the plant will try to do something with it, and if it doesn't have the appropriate matching minerals going on with it, it will start to make a whole bunch of incomplete proteins, which become very digestible to the pests. And so now you have a free meal coming for the pests, and that's really, the neon sign for a pest to be like, hey, this is out of balance. I am now no longer edible or healthy, and there's a free meal to be had, and come my way, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So that's how that goes. So
in the real world of cannabis, how does this play in? So if we've got groups of people, so we've got groups of people that are intending to do soil food web, so they're hopefully inoculating with compost that is biologically complete, whether through us or Catalyst. There's not a lot of people producing it right now. Ian is starting to produce it
or
as well.
if you're producing it yourself, just get qualified, or quantified, that it really is biologically complete, and learn how to make it yourself for sure. Yeah.
Right. So our first step is inoculating with these correct balance of organisms for a higher level plant. If you're growing cannabis or a vegetable crop or a forest, that is a higher level plant that requires certain balance of organisms in the soil, predator to prey interactions, quantities of fungi, and low levels of disease-causing organisms in order to perform those higher level plant functions. So if our intention is to be a living soil farm, and we're doing the first step, which is inoculation, the next step is we need to then keep it in that system of this proper nitrogen cycle and these predator to prey interactions that keeps the form of nitrogen in the appropriate form for higher level reproductive fruiting, flowering plants. And so people that are intending to do living soil then need to be aware of a few things. One is you can disrupt these natural cycles by overwatering. That's hands down the most common in living soil, especially if you're coming from other techniques. I feel like we're converting more salt-based farmers to living soil than anybody else on the planet right now, and that's something I really enjoy doing. The biggest obstacle of those people coming from other areas of cannabis cultivation specifically is the water volume. So when we go to a drain-to-waste coco coir facility and we very accurately measure the water usage of that facility, and then we change apples to apples into living soil, that living soil system will use typically somewhere between 1/5 or 1/7 the total water volume of that coco coir system. So when we're advising farms that have previously been doing coco systems or drain to waste of any type, typically even getting them to cut their water usage in half is quite the arm twisting activity. And, that's usually the biggest obstacle for those type of farmers. So
just repetition.
Yeah.
What's been safe for them.
Well, it sounds crazy.
It
sounds insane. And so the first step for us is trying to get somebody to use half the volume. If you use half the volume as you did in coco coir, you'll get a pretty good result, but you're going to persistently have powdery mildew pressure. And typically the strategies for dealing with that powdery mildew pressure will further hinder that farmer's ability to establish these soil food web numbers that we are looking for to match or exceed the results that they had in that coco coir system. So I know a lot of our audience members are actually consultants and soil food web graduates. And so in those situations, you need to really lay down the data to show to this farmer the direction that they're traveling before they hit this massive powdery mildew outbreak. Furthermore, those that are in the coco coir or drain to waste strategies, those plants can typically tolerate higher levels of pesticides. In a drain to waste system, And if you spray that plant with a fungicide, whether it's a biotech product or something natural or something systemic and nasty, the plant has the ability to dump that into the root zone. And the very next time you water, which is probably that same day, you're literally flushing it out of the system. So in a drain to waste system, the farmer and the plant are working cooperatively to dispose of those chemicals that are chosen for pest or mold control. When you take that farmer and put them into a living soil system, those compounds are now being banked in the root zone and become extremely antimicrobial for often several cycles. In the early years of us doing this, we saw a lot of systemic fungicides like Eagle 20 that would completely nuke every organism in that soil that next day. I mean, nuke everything. And so the biggest obstacle for people moving into living soil coming from other drain to waste strategies is not knowing that you and the plant were working cooperatively to flush these compounds out of the plant. In a permanent soil, you're now banking them. So that's a pretty standard obstacle for most people. So in those situations, if you're an advisor, what you need to do is take historical biological data along that timeline of that plant to show the farmer the direction they are going before it gets too bad to finish. Also, you want to target those biological assessments at the traditional times when an application of a fungicide or pesticide is traditionally applied. So you need to think about the life cycle of the cannabis plant. When is this farmer most likely to apply a systemic fungicide? Have your soil assessment come directly after that so you can catch it on the downslope before it has gone too long without nutrient cycling producing potential and also disease susceptibility. So that's one way that we deal with that. So you have a lot of farmers that are coming from other techniques that are now trying to work with this living soil system. If you're applying 5 times the water volume, I can promise you, you are not moving properly through this nitrifying cycle, and you are denitrifying and losing nutrients as a gas and starving your plants by overwatering or by applying IPM products that are antimicrobial, or usually both, honestly. Usually both. And then we have other living soil people that are now starting to dabble in anaerobic techniques. And that has gone from, tinkering and a hobby to a widespread movement, which is fascinating. And you just have to understand that if you're going to tinker with these anaerobic processes, you are putting yourself dead square in this denitrification process. Yeah. And so all of these ferments are literally loaded with nitrifying bacteria that are meant to decompose organic systems, not produce nutrients for higher level plants, which is what cannabis and vegetable and row crops are. And so you just have to understand that. So if you're going to move into these anaerobic processes, you need to understand that you are forcing a higher level plant into a form of nitrification that it's not accustomed to, has not evolved with, and is not actually looking for. This is a tremendous cause of pest and disease that needs to be managed. For those of you that have desire to be consultants or are working through the Soil Food Web course, this is a fact of life that you will have to navigate as an advisor. And you have to expect that people will be at least tinkering with this process or being full-blown involved in it and doing all anaerobic processes. So, it's a very difficult thing to navigate right now, but it's the reality of the world we're in, and it seems to be taking a lot of the focus of the living soil community, which is fine. We want to encourage everybody, but you just have to understand your plant is looking for a process that looks similar to this, where the nitrogen is predominantly in the ammonium form, and it is going through this cycle of recycling those nutrients in a healthy fashion. When you start to move into anaerobic ranges or use anaerobic techniques, you are operating in this range where your nutrients are being lost as a gas and you're force feeding the nitrogen from the vegetative cycle in the reproductive, which is a remarkable way to damage plants, we'll just say. So,
well, and if you're always moving back in succession as well, so let's say your input of organisms into the system is always a whole lot of either oomycetes or bacteria, then you're literally forcing the system to go back in succession and out of the range that your plant likely would need in order to get the nutrients it needs from a soil food web system that would be healthy. So there's a couple of things that go on with that. More than just the anaerobic conditions in this denitrification and losing other elements also as a gas. So it's just, there's more to it than that as well. So you just need to make sure that, we're not against home fermenting, but there's a couple of steps in the home fermenting that have been left out that we feel are very important. And one is sterilization, so that you control exactly what organisms are actually in the soil food web, so that you're not like overwhelming the system with a whole bunch of anaerobes. And then two would be to make sure that you get it measured. But most people, when they're trying to make something at home, they're likely not also then going to go get it measured. We would say that anything can be a medicine or what's the other word I'm looking for? It can be a medicine or it can be a poison, depending on the dose, anything. So you just need to know what it is you're working with. And so we would just always say, because we're usually working with commercial growers, and we would just say, know what it is that you're working with.
Yeah. So there's a question here about lactic acid ferment at a pH of 3.5 at a very low redox state produces any nitrate. Well, those are nitrifying bacteria. That's what they're doing. They're producing nitrate. And it does stink like a urinal. So what you're smelling is this process. You're smelling the off-gassing of things like phosphine gas and nitrous oxide and nitrate. So the entire process is relying on these nitrifying bacteria. In the soil, it happens when it's greater than 7. It doesn't mean that these nitrifying bacteria cannot be present in other things like lactic acid ferments. So I would love to test Ian's soil as well. He's welcome to send it in. I would do it for free. I've crossed paths with Ian several times as far back as 2016. I find it really interesting, his new strategy of only doing rock dust, because prior to that he was doing a full fertility strategy and balancing all the minerals and had a very solid understanding of the needed components. So I find it really interesting that he now recommends only rock dust, which does not contain any of those things. So I would love a soil so I could run a chemistry on it to see what's actually in there, and the biology, probably low likelihood of that.
Well, we haven't been on, to be fair, we haven't been on IG for 2 years, so
No.
maybe he's changed his tune. I don't know. Maybe he's doing more than rock dust. But no, we have not seen a KNF garden not have any issues at all. So,
with all due respect, hands down crop loss champions will never be surpassed by another organic technique, in my opinion.
Well, I think it just comes down to, we honestly always aim to not have any pests. I mean, I know that everybody always aims to not have pests and disease, but we know, like, if our gardens, if our clients' gardens have pest and disease, we've missed the mark somewhere. We're always going to the cause, and we're bringing everything back in balance. And so we're doing it with minerals, and we're doing it strategically with minerals and microbes and nutrition, and we're not using, we're just not using anaerobic forms of it, and everything that we do use is quantified. So we know exactly what we're working with and at what levels that we're working with them at. So we're actually making sure that we know what we're working with. So it's just a different way about going about it, but I can tell you that, like, our clients don't have these pests and disease issues, and we're moving them out of it.
And not just our clients, those that are truly sticking to the soil food web principles.
Yeah.
Nick Tomasini has the same exact results. He has phenomenal results. Same with us. The people that are truly sticking to this foundational principles have very little pest and disease issues. And a lot of people say this, but the problem with the information that's come down through the years is that there's so many pieces to this puzzle, right? And there's so many pieces to our personal puzzles as farmers that are coming from manufacturers of products, that are coming from people trying to get rid of waste streams, that are coming from social media accounts that are coming from people on the internet. And we try to get all these puzzle pieces together. And if you take all the puzzle pieces that are widely accepted and available out there, they don't necessarily fit together to make a puzzle that is pest and disease free. They're actually quite the opposite of that. They're quite remarkable at missing the mark entirely and creating pest and disease. And that's why I value the soil food web classes that I took so early on back in 2013 and 2014, because I had solid coaching of just plant management and behavior around the cultivation space, right? So some of you have heard me rant. I come from cultivators that you couldn't just come to the garage and talk about something you heard on the internet. Like, they would boo you off the stage or tell you to shut up, or you might get a fight out of it if you were ridiculous enough. I came from some pretty wild people. And the principles in that world was you had to execute it on your own farm, bring the flower, and then talk about it. There was none of this, I read something in a permaculture magazine, and none of these like dreamy ideas that nobody ever really applies properly. And taking those foundational principles of only talking about things that I've personally executed more than once with success, on top of the foundational education that I learned from Dr. Lane, with the tool of the microscope to quantify anything I wanted, is what got us to this level. And so by using the microscope as a tool to always stay in a safe window, as advisors, we have a remarkably high success rate of guiding farms to remarkable outcomes and out of pest and disease issues, because we are guiding all decisions based on what that microscope assessment reveals to us. Where it gets hard for people in the living soil community is the microscope might show you that the idea is wrong, and that's just something you have to be able to accept. And that is something that has been in our journey. There's been things that I thought were a great idea. We put them into practice, and the microscope assessment says this is not the right solution, or it made it worse, or we needed to adjust it and we had to fine tune it. And as a professional advisor that was working with farms with millions of dollars on the line, literally, we could not ever put anybody into a precarious predicament. And so when we worked comprehensively and extensively with the farm, we made all guiding decisions within the parameters of the light microscope methods of Dr. Lane, and that kept us in very high 90% great success rates with our consulting clients. Every now and then shit happens. It is what it is. About once a year I boof one pretty good, usually because of disorganization or taking on too many projects is usually where the problems come from. But when we stick to those principles of maintaining aerobic soils, keeping high predator to prey interactions, keeping the oomycete levels down, you can pretty much ensure a remarkable outcome even from literally novice growers. We have more and more farmers every year that have had zero cannabis cultivation experience that jump right into living soil systems. They are very coachable, and they are blowing away commercial, generally accepted commercial cultivation yields. Yeah. We've got a couple people right now that had zero harvests under their belt, followed exactly the protocol, and are hitting 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 grams per watt of lighting. Are you kidding me? Back in 2016, 2017, we were working with tip of the top, and clearing that 1 gram per watt consistently was what allowed you to be a profitable business. And now with the new lighting and the understanding of living soil, we've taken several people a year with zero growing experience right to 1.5 grams per watt of lighting, which is a remarkable outcome. And so, it's not for everybody. I know a lot of people get fairly resistant, but I think what's still really lacking in the community is widespread analysis using the microscope. And we've done a horrendous amount of it. So we have a tremendous amount of understanding from the math that we've laid out for farmers. A lot of times that math isn't shared for obvious reasons. And most of the people still in this living soil aren't really doing enough tracking with the microscope to make solid foundational understandings of what is the cause and effect of all of our decisions in this cultivation space.
To inform the process.
And then it gets a little bit confusing. There's other social media accounts, people literally showing you how to harvest disease and champion disease, and then that gets confusing. And then that's when I sound like a loony bin. What
I
are you
mean,
gonna
I
do?
just think that's what's happening out in the world, is that there's a whole lot of just confusion, whether it's purposeful or not. There's just a whole lot of confusion. Yeah, there's many ways to get there, but I think that we're at a critical period in history where we really have to figure out how to get there in harmony with the earth, in harmony with nature, something that doesn't produce as a result toxic compounds, something that doesn't necessitate having toxic compounds in the system. You know, that's been my goal all along, is to how do we actually grow a healthy plant without actually ever even needing a pesticide. It's not that we don't ever use a knockback or something like that. It's just that it needs to be appropriate. It needs to just be a bridge from one system that isn't working to a system that does actually work. You know, I just don't know how we're ever going to get away from, you know, reproducing all of these toxic compounds in mass if we don't actually start to transition to a system that doesn't need them in mass. So, you know, understanding how the nitrogen moves in the system is paramount to understanding, you know, how to not need these pesticides by not force feeding this high nitrates into the plant. So,
And I think this comment by Sal is the most important part. And when I was talking about like people not playing around, and when I came into cannabis in 2009, most of my mentors were from the 90s and 2000s. And prior to 2010, it was still fairly illegal and sketchy to grow. And so most people worked on a mentor-mentee relationship, and they took those relationships very seriously. And they weren't just handed out. And I'm not saying it was better than everything now, but what you have to understand about the current climate of cannabis cultivation is prior to 2010, you had qualified people executing successfully in very illegal markets that handed down one-to-one, face-to-face strategies that were working, and you could see very clearly that those strategies were working. Around 2010, 2011 is what I define the Prop 215 comfort era, where most people felt really comfortable stacking permits all the way to 1,000 plants and were fairly casual about that. And at that time period is when, you know, prices started dropping down below the comfort level of those older growers, and a lot of those people fell out. At that same time, you now had brand new cultivators with no mentor-mentee relationship that were now putting their education in the hands of the hydroponic stores. And so you went from the farmer communicating to the farmer to the person trying to sell you shit to the person that didn't know any better. And now in the Instagram era, it's completely tomfoolery, because now you have the people trying to sell you stuff, creating Instagram accounts, promoting the things that they want to sell you. So you as the farmer with no direct relationship with another cultivator, now we've moved into this, what we see most often is correct. And from a scientific standpoint, from a mathematical standpoint, most of the things that are most commonly viewed are very incorrect. And that's not an opinion. That is a statistical mathematical fact that you can find in textbooks, or by using mathematical tools like the microscope or the soil chemistry analysis. So using foundational, proven scientific standards. And those type of comments that I just said then start to turn off a lot of the living soil people. And people want to then do everything through intention and do everything through feel. And that's fine. We are all about intention. You can see all the goofy hippie shit we got in the background here. We are all about intention. We are all about feel. When we look at the historical data from every single farm we've worked with, which has been literally millions of square feet of cultivation space around the actual planet, not just in California, the United States. We have international farms that we've worked with. We've had like 1 or 2 farms get fairly close to proper mineral chemistry through feel. And that's just a statistical math. And of those 2, the one guy was a Humboldt guy. He was super hippie trippy. He'd read you poetry and shit. He was out there. Cool dude. He dead nuts hit base saturation for calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium. He was high on his nitrogen, and he completely missed the sulfur in the soil. At the same time, managing all these OGs, he had to spray a certain amount of sulfur every week. When I came on, I sat down and asked him to weigh out the amount of sulfur that he was spraying per week, and I calculated that up per week and added it all up for the harvest cycle, and that amount of sulfur is what kept him just above the minimum on the soil. That is
We find this all the time.
that is the closest we've ever come to a farmer shooting it by the hip with fuel and hitting generally accepted targets for soil chemistry. From a biological standpoint, I can't think of one farmer that was just shooting from the hip and
hit everything.
Not even close, I don't think. And most of that's because of the availability of proper inoculant, right? So if you're shooting from the hip on biology and you don't have a proper inoculant, of course you're not going to get there. So that's a little bit of a weighted statistic because very few percentage of the farmers are actually working with biologically complete compost material in a fashion that would lead to biologically complete inoculation. So when you look at the statistical analysis, just unemotional, just numerically from all the millions of square feet of cultivation, there's been like one guy come close to soil chemistry. Most people are many, 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 many times off, I think the most off we ever had was a farm working by fuel, and it would have taken 13 harvest cycles to bring his soil into balance. So nowhere near. And so we need to get back to farmers being able to do that. I trust that the Native Americans did shit by feel. They didn't have no microscope or soil chemistry tests.
They also didn't have, a couple hundred years of completely obliterating the soil with toxins and robbing the soil of organic matter either. I mean, they had like all those bison building the soil in all their grasslands. They didn't have an issue at all.
Right.
I mean, I would not think that they would have an issue with all those bison taking care of the grasslands. Mm-hmm. So
maybe we should talk about...
That's context for you. That's context. Like today's world is you just have to take into context of where we are now with all of the years, hundreds of years that, they were talking about issues with the soil. They were deeply concerned with the soil at the turn of the 1900s.
Right.
Deeply concerned that we were losing our fertility.
It's terrifying.
And that was then. It's now 120 years later, 122 years later.
So I think maybe we should take a moment to speak in reality about what happens in our consulting experience. So when we come on with a farm, you have to understand that Sarah and I enjoy bringing farmers from the depths of hell to the top of the industry. So we tend to attract farmers that are having tremendous problems. I would say that our consulting work is split, generally speaking, down the middle of farmers that are on the brink of absolute disaster or are doing well and want to find peak potential. I don't think it's exactly one-to-one, but we'll just say as the mindsets are split in our farmers. We get people that are trying things that aren't working and it's exploding on them or they're about to lose their farm. And then we have farmers that want to see how far they can push the peak potential of this farm. Interestingly enough, when we first started doing consulting, we started out only doing the microscope assessment of the soils because I had a really accomplished, indoor trap history, but that didn't mean that I could jump into a 100,000 square foot building and start calling all the shots, And so I took a very humble approach and only provided advice on the thing that I knew I was the best at that time. And then as we started to build skills, then obviously we include that into our consulting. But when we first started with farmers and only did the microscope assessment, you could remarkably reduce most of the problems just by doing that. Statistically, you would see 30 to 40% increase in all categories that were beneficial. So yield would go up 30 to 40%. Potency would often go 20 to 30%. And costs would then go down 30 to 40%. Most often from the hours of labor applied to managing problems, scouting problems, putting out fires, performing activities that do not increase yield or increase quality or potency, like spraying pest management products. So in that first year, we did a shitload of cultivation space. In that first year, we worked with top living soil farmers on the planet, and we worked with very large organizations. The largest organization we worked with in our first year of consulting had 26 different properties and 1 million square feet of indoor and greenhouse cultivation, some above, some below. Nonetheless, we had a lot of repetitions on performing these assessments and the corrections to the assessment. What we found was that either watering or your nutrient strategy was driving things anaerobic. If you're not inoculating with the soil food web compost, a biologically complete compost, and then you're driving things further anaerobic with water quantities or nutrient applications, you're then constantly in the problems, as well as having low production because you're not getting the advantage of the organism to organism interactions that are producing nutrients for your plant, as well as being in this denitrification phase where you're losing nutrients as a gas. So simply inoculating with biologically complete compost and behaving in a way that maintains those aerobic numbers almost overnight can give you 30 to 40%. In most of those situations for the first 2 years, it would reduce pest pressures to specific hotspots. Once we inoculated those soils with biologically complete compost and managed behavior to maintain desirable numbers based on the Dr. Elaine chart, we then found that the pests would live predominantly in a specific section because they weren't just widespread now. Now that those pest problems weren't widespread, it was easier to stand back and look and say, the source of this pest problem in this living soil garden is because this dehumidifier is right above this bed. And this dehumidifier is desiccating this soil, which is keeping nutrient cycling very low. This plant is starving and you now have thrips. When a farmer sees bugs in a room, they widespread treat everything. So now when you're spraying pesticides on every single plant, you're now reducing overall yield production across your entire facility. The biggest leap of faith for a farmer to take is realizing that you should more than likely spot treat and try to identify the source of what is actually causing this problem. In living soil farms, it's almost always the location of your dehumidifier and indoor environment, or where the intake and the exhaust is in a greenhouse. If you can maintain high biological populations in most of those soils, those pest problems will remove themselves from most of those cultivation spaces. Now you can start to focus on what the actual problem is, and that's what we did. So in the early years of our consulting, I would actually work at farms for an extended period of time. The one farm that had 26 different properties, I worked there 40 plus hours a week for 9 months. I was in that greenhouse and multiple facilities every single day, and Sarah would come and execute microscope analysis, and then we would do data for that farm. And then that data would come in from most of the 26 farms. Our adjustments would then go back out to most of those 26 farms. And in that first year, with that many properties running 4 cycles, we got essentially 100 years of cultivation experience under our belt, fine-tuning one of the top cultivators in the entire cannabis industry, to be clear. And so in those situations, when you're able to lessen widespread pest pressure or mold pressure on your plants, it starts to become more clear where the actual problem is coming from.
I think we just have more faith in the disease and the pest than we do in the actual solution to it, which is nutrition and biology and microbes.
Yeah.
And that's really what's sad in the state of affairs that we're in. But that's the way that the cookie has been crumbling. So, but even on broad acreage, if they were to see a pest in one area, they're going to spray their entire broad acreage with it and with whatever pesticide or fungicide that they need to, and they're not going to. Yep. They're going to say, that is to protect the crop, and we would say, okay, but also you need to get to the solution. You need to get to the underlying cause. Otherwise, it's just going to be more on and more on and more on. Right. So you need to get spray to heal and not to kill, and exactly. Get behind. Get in front of that curve from the get-go.
I think what farmers don't realize is any choice you make of any product available, for a pest or disease management product, it will have a negative downstream effect on the metabolism of that plant. So if you're having a pest or mold issue, you already are having an issue with nutrition and or likely biological matters in the soil. And so you're already kind of at that threshold of going down the hill. If you start spraying 2-3 times a week, you're going to push those plants that were on the edge directly into the problems by what Francois Chaboseau, which is the yellow book behind my head right there, Healthy Crops, he defines it as trophobiosis, which is protein breakdown. So the plant is trying to synthesize proteins and combine components together to produce full and complete healthy cells. And as soon as you spray a pest control product on that plant, you disassemble that process and now start the protein breakdown process. So
calling in more pests.
Calling in more pests. Yeah. And so, the only farms that we don't have success like this, where we actually do completely eliminate mold and completely eliminate pest issues, are those farmers that are dead set on spraying 2-3 times a week of pesticides, which I've said on multiple shows. The guys that I learned from, that was not even something that came in after 2011 when the mentor became the person trying to sell you shit. And so you need to get yourself a good mentor that is actually performing, not Instagram performing, but actually performing. Which is why we've produced these classes. We want to speak one-on-one with farmers and guide them into a successful strategy that has been proven on literally millions of square feet of cultivation space by us, as well as Nick Tomasini. We take a very similar approach. He runs Humankind Oregon. If you find me abrasive, hit him up. He's kind of the polar opposite to me. But he'll get you the same results that we do with a little more gentle words that are more appropriate to your weenie ears. So if you want to hear it like it is and get right to it, this is the spot. If you can't handle that, then I can't help you, fam. Hello. So what have we even said today, Sarah? Have we even made sense? I feel like I'm drunk. So. I'm just kidding. To recap, the reason why you have bugs is because you're spraying for bugs. You have to take the leap of faith to put measurable ways to quantify the direction you're going. I will always choose the microscope assessment first. I will also choose the soil chemistry second. And I like the Malic 3 test from Logan Labs, followed by the saturated paste as a supplement to the Malic 3. If you're doing living soil and actually inoculating with biologically complete compost and you only focus on the saturated paste, you're never going to get there. You have to manage the Malic 3 and the saturated paste together. Put the Malic 3 first. That's a lot of the pest problems. Most of the living soil farmers out there are following amendment and top dress strategies that drive you way below the quantity needed of calcium to have a healthy plant, drive you way higher than what you need for magnesium, which is a quality and yield killer, which pushes you into a position to force potassium to try and increase the yield. And now instead of those cells being filled with calcium and being rigid and sturdy and pest resistant, they are now filled with a potassium electrolyte, are now weak, watery, and susceptible to pests. So all of these strategies for top dressing, regardless of who it comes from, is pushing you into pest pressure. I promise you that. So if you're going to do that, you need to do the Logan test, Malic 3, get those calcium levels up to where they need to be. You need to chill out with the magnesium. You need to chill out with the potassium. And you need to build that house and raise it up with calcium. And then you need to manage the biological populations in the soil. My personal preference, based on millions of square feet of cultivation space with literal leaders and top 1% of the industry, has shown that when you keep that omysate value as low as possible and you keep the beneficial fungi number as high as possible and you guide your decisions with those two factors, you will never see powdery mildew again. That is the easiest thing to guarantee. When we went through these classes, we went through Dr. Elaine's school and got to the point where we were sitting down at the dinner table with her. I was communicating some of the things that we were seeing. I was using words like guarantee and forecast. She said you should never use the word guarantee or forecast. And I will come on mother effing YouTube and say, I can guarantee you, if you follow those parameters, you will not see powdery mildew. And she warned me that I will be attacked for saying things like that. She was dead ass right on that. Shout out to Dr. Lane. She tried to keep me out of the bullseye, but I just had to jump in front of a couple trains in the means of trying to educate y'all some bitches. So watch out for bullseyes. Don't make guarantees, but I will guarantee you 0 powdery mildew if you drive that omoseeds to the ground. If you go to get rice from the forest and cultivate fuzzy stuff, good luck. You're on your own with that one.
It was I'll go back in the comments a bit.
Yeah, so a couple LOLs on the rant. Usually that's when the engagement drops. Shout out to the homies still being on there.
How many tests per cycle for indoor would you recommend, or can you get by with one? So one will only give you a snapshot of what you're looking at,
Well,
right?
Let's define what type of test. So you're talking about biological.
Yeah, we were talking about biology when we were talking at that point. I'm pretty sure he's talking about biology.
I think so as well.
Correct us if we're wrong, but if we're talking about biology, a microbial test, what we call a bioassay, I would not do just one. I would do one will only give you a snapshot of where you are right then and there. It won't give you a trend over time. And so what you're looking for, hopefully, is to understand what you're doing, in the cultivation space and how that lends itself to the type of microbial profile you're after. So you want that trend over time, and you want to be able to see the trending in the right direction, the greens and blue boxes.
When we first started doing this, advisors, the first Living Soil Farms, those real notable ones that we worked with, we did a horrendous amount of assessment, because typically in those situations it was just after a commercial regulated crop loss, which is very expensive, which means you failed testing and had to destroy that product. That's the worst type of crop loss. Or they were starting to have elevated values on the tests, which was putting them into the threshold of possibly losing a crop to a test fail. And so the motivation to find out what that cause was very high. And a couple $100 tests was not ridiculous when you're looking at $70 to $150, sometimes $200,000 in flower that needs to be destroyed in a single harvest. So we did a lot. We dissected rooms like you would not believe. We would do multiple microscope assessments of a room, trying to answer certain questions. We did this dissection so many times that if you had a farm with 4 beds in a greenhouse and they sent us a bioassay from each 4, I could tell you the way that they walk through their facility with the watering wand, because of how that trend plays out and how they distribute the organisms, and how that uneven distribution of organisms starts to happen across the space. It's easiest to track with the nematodes. That's the easiest one. Yeah. But nonetheless, we did a lot. What we found is like a happy medium of the minimum that we think you should do and the maximum of what most farms feel comfortable spending the money on, is doing it every 2 weeks for an entire harvest cycle.
Yeah. Or a minimum of 3.
Or a minimum of 3. Yeah. So
you want to
2
trend
weeks
over time.
So we'll say minimum is 3.
Very minimum is 3. I would probably do 4. Personally, I would do at least 4. But that's just, when you're learning, and especially when you're starting off in your cycle, you want to know where you're at in veg. You want to know where you're at before you go into flower. You want to know where you're at when you're in flower. Those trends, at the very front of the whole process are really important, because you can only do so much when you're deep in flower. Right. So you want to make sure that you're trending the way that you need to be trending, and can make any adjustments, have time to make those adjustments before you get deep into flower, and can't do a whole lot about it. Right. So,
So as consultants and advisors, when we're working with major farms, there's a lot of liability on the line. So we always establish a baseline. We have to know where you've been before we start tinkering, so that, just to be point blank, there's no finger pointing, right? So we don't want anybody blaming anybody. So we just establish baselines, and that shows where you're at.
And it tells us if we need to do something immediately
Good point.
to do a knockback. I mean,
point.
where are we at? If you've got like a whole bunch of oomycetes in the system,
Good point.
you're already in the anaerobic zone, and it doesn't matter how great our compost is or how great the extract is that you made. You could put it and apply it perfectly, but if you're lobbing it into an environment that's already selecting for anaerobic and disease, then you're only going to go so far. It's going to work against you. So we have to get an idea of where you're at first, make sure that there's no barriers to the compost and the extract before we put it in, to make sure that it's actually going to be successful.
Good point.
Yeah.
So we establish a baseline to know where you're at and where you're going. And like she said, if it's so anaerobic, we're going to knock it back first.
Yeah.
So we establish a baseline at the start. Typically, you see radical changes in biology 7 to 10 days after you start inoculating is what we found. So economically, what makes the most sense is 10 to 14 days after you first start putting biologically complete compost into that system is when it makes the most sense, because those organisms are turning over every 20, 40, 60 minutes, every couple hours. And so you inoculate, and then the patterns of your behavior in that cultivation environment will then trend and start to level out 7 to 10 days after you make that radical change. That's kind of with everything, I guess. So 10 to 14 days after you first inoculate, and then ideally every 10 to 14 days after that. And so we do it every couple weeks for an entire harvest cycle. Yeah. If you're doing it at a minimum, you can inoculate, do it about 2 weeks after, and then you're going to want to do it at the critical points. So typically, there's not much you can do for improvement of yield after week 4 of flower if something's already wrong. So we tend to want to know entering flowering where you're at. And then we want to know where you're at that last moment where you can impact the overall yield of that plant. So it doesn't do me much good to come in week 5 or week 6 of the cannabis life cycle and see where you're at biologically if you've been flatlined for the last 4 weeks when that plant is preparing to fill that. There's nothing I can do to repair that yield.
Well, there's very limited.
Well,
limited.
I will not be able
Much
to
more
meet
limited.
our standards at that point is what I'll say. So there's always something you can do. So for those home growers, there's people going through the school. There's people going through Sarah's class. Find these people and see if they're willing to do some for free. In order to build up my expertise and to feel, honestly, to feel comfortable that I was accurate, I did free microscope assessment for anybody that would send it to me on Instagram for an entire year. That was hands down the most valuable experience that I have ever had, because I got to see so many people's soils, and in those situations they were more open actually. So that first year I had the most open farmers telling me what they had done and what was going on, and I got to see the soil sample. Once we started professionally consulting, you get less and less open farmers, I guess we'll say, and you have to fill in more gaps. So with that, I got a good foundation of what to expect and what might be happening, as well as doing it in my own garden. We did a shitload of microscope assessments. So try to find somebody that's just graduated from the school or graduated from Sarah's microscope program and see if they're willing to do a trade or do some for free or low cost, and get the reps in. If you're a commercial living soil farm, meaning your income for this flower is dependent on the yield, that means you could have a 4-light back bedroom. In a legacy market, I would still define you as a commercial cannabis farmer. You cannot afford to not do this stuff, in my opinion. Like I said, 5-6 years ago, when we were doing nothing else that we do now comprehensively, just correcting biology got 30 to 40% increase in yield of the top cultivators in the industry on the planet. Imagine what it would do for a home grower. So, you like, even at $100 a sample or 60, I think people range from $60 to $150. I know that's a lot for a home grower, but I promise you, even in a 4-lighter, you're going to get that money back. So find a way, recycle some cans, do a trade maybe, at the end of harvest, kick down some weight to the homie that did the math, whatever you want to do. But functionally, yeah, the easy answer is inoculate once a week, and whatever dumb stuff you do throughout the week that's killing biology is going to be replaced. Now you just need to time it. So don't inoculate on Monday and then do your IPM crap Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, because you just killed everything. I promise you. No matter what product you're using, I promise you it's very antimicrobial. The most popular stuff is the most antimicrobial.
And then, so is using a compost extract a better route for best inoculation? We use I wouldn't say just a compost extract. I would define it even further and say a biocomplete compost extract, which means you're using a biocomplete or biologically complete compost, meaning it meets the minimum numbers of the organisms in the entire soil food web of the beneficials that you need for the plant that you're trying to grow. So you're using a compost that meets those parameters first, and then you're making an appropriate extract from that compost. And so that's what I would say a compost extract is. A lot of people think that I can just get some compost and then, wash it in water, and that's a compost extract. You actually have to start with biologically complete compost, or you'll never get to that goal, and you may even be adding detriment. So you want to qualify that compost first and make sure that it actually is biologically complete, and then make an extract from it.
That's a good point. So we sell our compost at cggdistro.com. You can see it there. We sell it in the half cubic foot box. Other people that sell it, there's Catalyst Bioamendments and Ian at Cure Soil, the only 3 people I know producing large amounts of true biologically complete compost that's being quantified. Obviously, I think mine is the best. We now sell ours already pre-inoculated with HB nematodes and SF nematodes, which are the 2 most common predatory nematodes that people buy. So we're first in the industry for that. And all of our compost comes. So for you small growers that don't want to spend $100 overnighting a sponge of nematodes, they now come in our compost. So we just recommended those to so many people. We finally just figured out a way to get them into our compost. So they're just in there now. So right on.
Yeah, you can't extract something that isn't there. That's the whole point. You can't extract something that isn't there, so you got to qualify it. Make sure that your inoculum actually contains the organisms in it that you are looking for.
Exactly.
So.
Well, with that, I think we've done enough to piss off the internet. Hopefully, help some people out there that are open-minded and can hear a new way. And we hope we've put you on a path towards success.
Nefarious Minds, you had a question about a compost class. So I haven't been doing those as a master class. I just have them as videos. So because what I find is that anybody is, most people that are making compost, it's like we can't all, for whatever reason, we don't seem to coordinate together very well. And so even when I had my what was it, a webinar for it, and had people all together, people just, it's such a timely or time-consuming process that not everybody really does it all at the same time. So I found that just making the videos, then you can take the class whenever you need to. And most people will buy it right when they're ready to, really start getting serious about it. And so I just have the classes online, and then if you want my mentorship, you can purchase the mentorship too, and that's for the small batch composting. So you can do that either way. I don't know that I've had really much request to do it as a master class just for that reason. Right. But I'm not opposed to doing it as a master class if people would rather. I feel like nowadays we're starting to get more and more people who really want to do a master class because they want the camaraderie. Yeah. They want to be in a class with like-minded people, and so I'm certainly not opposed to doing that. If I have several people asking for a master class, I'll certainly do a master class on it. But I have the video. You can take it whenever you'd like to take it. So, and then just reach out if you have questions or whatever. So let's see.
We're seeing a lot of luck with the master classes because it accelerates the learning. So we're halfway through our second soil balancing class and our second Crescent Method basic training, which is how we train our consulting clients. So we're going to fire those up again. So stay tuned for those. Yeah.
Sal, on that SD microbes, I would, it's one thing. Well, one, biocomplete is a trademark term by Dr. Elaine, so he's going to be in trouble for that. But but if they don't have an actual assay with it, then you could certainly try to buy some, but if it's that pricey, it might not even be worth it. Just get some where it is actually quantified.
I believe SD Microbes uses a lot of bokashi, in which that would not make the grade for me, but
okay, so in my journey of making biologically complete compost, usually when you're inoculating or trying to utilize a certain level of anaerobic organisms, so like let's say you're using beer mash, that's a fermented microbe in it, you have to be very cautious with how much you actually use, otherwise you swing the whole thing into anaerobic conditions. So
if it's fuzzy, it ain't gonna cut the grade for me.
Yeah. So anyway, for what it's worth, just make sure that your compost is actually biologically complete. So.
Yeah. And if you're not sure, send it to us, and we'll give you a thumbs up or thumbs down. And stay tuned for the next Science Bro. We're gonna take a week or so off and take a little bit of time for ourselves, but we'll catch you up in a couple weeks.
We'll be on the road
with some more internet-breaking conversations.
We could tune in from the road. You never know. But we wouldn't have this. We're not lovely setup. So.
No, dude, I'm off. I'm off. We give our lives for this shit. I'm off for 9 days. True. I'm off. Okay. So.
All right. And I love you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. And we will see you when we return. Hopefully on the 29th. We'll be back. So.
All right, homies.
Thanks so much. We wish you much success in your gardens.
Yeah, that.